At 7:20 a.m., the coral cuts through his uniform like broken glass. Private First Class Calvin Reese, G Company, 321st Infantry Regiment, 81st Infantry Division, is 30 meters from an enemy position that should not still be standing. He has been crawling for 11 minutes. His left arm won't stop bleeding. The field dressing is already soaked through, the white cloth gone dark red from the center out. He has 7 rounds left in his M1 Garand and 1 spare clip, 8 more. In the pouch on his left hip, 15 rounds. He stopped counting the pistol an hour ago. Around him, nothing, no one. His platoon was here 40 minutes ago. 23 men pushing up the broken face of Hill 140 in the Umurbrogol pocket. The coral fortress that Japan's 14th Division had spent weeks converting into something that wasn't a defensive position so much as a killing machine built from limestone and shadow. 6 weeks before Reese crawled through this coral, the 1st Marine Division had bled itself nearly to destruction trying to crack this same ridge. 3 Marine battalions, hundreds of dead. The position had not fallen. Now it was the Army's turn. The briefing said 300 defenders. The map said there was a negotiable approach from the southwest. Both of those things Cal Reese now knows with absolute certainty were wrong. Above him, somewhere in the coral darkness, a Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun rotates slowly on its pivot mount, and he can hear it. A mechanical whisper beneath the smell of cordite and wet rock, searching. It has already found 4 men from his platoon this morning. It did not miss any of them. He presses his bleeding arm against the rock and goes completely still. He should be dead. 11 minutes ago, an enemy soldier fired from a position that didn't appear on any American map. A vertical crack in the coral wall on his right flank, invisible from every approach angle except the one he'd taken. The round passed less than 6 inches from his head. He felt the air move against his ear. He felt it. What he did in the 3 seconds after that shot is why he is still alive, and why he is still moving toward that gun. Calvin Reese was from Muncie, Indiana. He was 22 years old in October 1944, even though the men in his platoon often forgot this. He didn't carry himself like a 22-year-old. He was lean and unhurried in the way that men from the Indiana flatlands sometimes are. The kind of quiet that isn't shyness but patience. A man who has spent enough years watching the horizon that waiting becomes second nature. He had grown up on his father's grain farm 6 miles outside Muncie, second of 4 children. He'd learned to shoot on the back 40, picking off groundhogs that burrowed under the fence rows and destroyed the crops. Not for sport, but because the farm needed it. He could hit a target at 300 yards with open sights without apparent effort. It wasn't a gift. It was just something his hands knew how to do, the same way other men's hands knew carpentry or engine repair. His hands knew the rifle, and he enlisted in November 1942, 3 weeks after his 20th birthday at the Federal Building in Indianapolis. When the recruiter asked why, he reportedly said, "Because someone's got to." It wasn't the answer the recruiter expected. It was the only answer Cal had. He didn't make speeches about vengeance or glory. He just understood that the war was real, that men who could shoot were needed in it, and that he could shoot. The arithmetic was simple. His platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Eldon Watts, would later write to Reese's mother, "Your boy was the best rifleman I ever commanded, and I commanded a lot of them. He had a way of seeing a situation, all of it at once, that I never saw in another man." Some soldiers panic when everything falls apart. Cal Reese got quieter. In his breast pocket, folded into quarters, and he carried a letter from his younger sister, Margaret. She was 17, still in school back in Muncie. The letter was dated September 3rd, 1944, more than 6 weeks before Peleliu. In it, she had written one line he'd read enough times that he didn't need to unfold the paper to see it. "Just come home, Cal. Everything else is just everything else." He had promised her he would. That promise was now the only thing in his chest pocket heavier than the letter itself. Before we go any further, if you want to go deeper into stories like this one, the unit histories, the tactical details, the survivor accounts that don't fit in a video, I publish all of it in the Combat Blueprint, my free newsletter. Takes 10 seconds to join. Link is in the description. Now, ease back to Cal Reese and what he was walking into. To understand what Calvin Reese was walking into on October 14, 1944, you have to understand what was waiting for him. The Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Division, the Utsunomiya Division, was not a garrison unit assembled to defend an island. Formed in 1905 and blooded in the Russo-Japanese War, the division had accumulated campaign honors across Manchuria and China before the Pacific. Their commander on Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had studied every failed Japanese island defense in the war and drawn the same conclusion from all of them. The beach model was finished. Nakagawa's answer was the Umurbrogol, a ridge complex of porous limestone and coral riddled with over 500 interlocking caves and prepared fighting positions, each reinforced with steel and concrete, in each sited to provide overlapping fire coverage for its neighboring position. His men did not defend the beaches. They let the Americans land, let them push inland, and then they opened fire from elevations and angles that no naval bombardment had been able to touch. The 1st Marine Division, some of the finest assault infantry in the American order of battle, had taken 45 days and thousands of casualties trying to reduce this fortress. 3 full Marine battalions had been so devastated they required replacement. That was who held Hill 140. When G Company, 2nd Battalion, 321st Infantry Regiment was assigned to continue the assault on Hill 140 on the southern face of the Umurbrogol pocket, the intelligence briefing assessed the enemy's strength at approximately 300 defenders. In the maps identified a viable approach route along the southwestern face of the ridge. The briefing was wrong on both counts. Sometime in the night before October 14th, Colonel Nakagawa had moved reinforcements into the Hill 140 network. Additional platoons drawn from his tunnel-connected reserve, bringing actual strength to approximately 500 men. The southwestern approach, assessed as negotiable, had been precisely zeroed by 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns and a 70mm battalion infantry gun positioned in a prepared revetment near the crest. Their overlapping fields of fire converged at the exact terrain feature the American maps had identified as the approach corridor. The Japanese had read their own ground correctly. The Americans had not. At 0720 on October 14th, G Company moved out in 2 assault waves. Reese was in the 2nd wave, trailing Sergeant Watts by 15 meters. At 0733, the 1st wave hit the machine gun fields. 7 men went down in 30 seconds. The radio traffic became noise. Watts was already trying to pull the 2nd wave back when the order came, not from battalion but from regimental command. The assault on Hill 140 was being paused. Artillery was being redirected to a flanking action on the northern ridge. G Company was to hold its present position and await further instructions. Hold assumed a position. G Company no longer had one. In the chaos that followed, 3 squads pulling back under coordinated fire, Casualties being dragged across open coral, Watts trying to organize a defensive line behind a rock outcrop. Cal Reese found himself too far forward. The machine gun field was now sweeping the exact ground he would have to cross to follow his unit back. He tried once. The coral 3 inches from his left elbow exploded. He went flat and stopped. By 07:45, the main body of G Company had pulled back to a defensible position. Reese was on the wrong side of the machine gun. He had no radio. His water was low. He had his M1 Garand, his pistol, 4 8-round clips of .30-06 ammunition, and a field dressing that was about to become necessary. Because a fragment had found his left arm during the pullback and it was bleeding. The mission to capture Hill 140 was still technically active. He was the only American close enough to it to do anything about it. At 08:11, Cal Reese started moving, not retreating. Forward. He had spent 26 minutes flat in the coral studying the ridge and watching the machine gun traverse. Timing the intervals, reading the muzzle dust and the angles of fire to map the dead ground between positions. The blind spots that only existed because the entire defensive architecture had been designed to stop a coordinated assault with clear approach lanes. Not a single man who would not move in a straight line. The Type 92 traversed left to right in 4-second sweeps, then held 2 seconds on the right flank before reversing. There was a crease in the rock, barely a depression, 11 meters ahead and 7 degrees left of his position. He counted. He moved on the sweep. He made it in 3 seconds. He lay there breathing for 60 seconds. Then he mapped the next move. This was how Cal Reese fought, not fast, not reckless. Patient in the way a man who learned to shoot by watching groundhog holes learns patience, knowing that movement reveals position, and position determines everything else. Above him, the Japanese defensive system was operating at its designed peak. The 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns were positioned at staggered elevations, one covering the lower approach slope, one sweeping the mid-ridge, their arcs overlapping precisely to leave no dead ground from any conventional approach angle. The 70mm battalion gun was sighted in its prepared revetment near the crest, its 4-man crew drilling the exact sequence they'd practiced since the Americans had first landed on the island. The riflemen distributed across the cave network and fighting pits were not panicking. They were waiting. Ammunition came through the tunnel system. The water was underground. Food could sustain the garrison for weeks. They had beaten 3 Marine battalions from this hill. Their commander on Hill 140 was First Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of the fighting at Wuhan and the bitter early months of the Peleliu defense. He was calm. He knew exactly what a U.S. infantry assault looked like. The coordinated suppressing fire, the flanking elements, the artillery preparation. He had planned for all of it. Every American approach had a pre-calculated response. His position was not just fortified, it was thought through. At 08:34, Reese moved from his 3rd position, a shell crater 20 meters from the southwestern approach, and the trap closed. He hadn't seen the 2nd position. It wasn't on any map, wasn't visible from any standard approach angle. They tucked into a vertical crack in the coral wall on his right flank. 2 Japanese soldiers with an Arisaka Type 38 rifle and a grenade supply, placed there specifically to kill anyone who navigated the machine gun fields and assumed they were past the worst of it. A standard counter-infiltration position, textbook execution. The first round came from 5 meters away and hit the rock 6 inches above his head. In 3.2 seconds, and by his own later account, Cal Reese dropped flat, rolled left, and fired twice from the ground without raising his rifle above his chin. The first round missed, the second did not. The third man was reaching for a grenade. He used one more round. He lay in the coral dust for a moment, his hands pressing against the stock of the Garand, the arm bleeding harder from the exertion. A hidden position, a kill zone that should have ended the conversation. He was past the outer ring. What he did in the next 90 seconds made no tactical sense. Until you understand what he had already seen. Something no other American on that battlefield, from any other approach angle, could have seen. He had seen the steam. From the shell crater, his third position 26 minutes into the study of this ridge, he'd noticed a thin ribbon of vapor rising from a crack in the coral about 30 meters upslope and left of the main firing pit. Not smoke, steam. Underground water reacting to the heat differential as the morning temperature rose against the porous limestone, which meant there was a cave access point nearby, not visible from below, but accessible from the flank if you came at it from an angle that required first getting past an outer ring no one had penetrated before. He moved left. Inside the Japanese position, the effect was immediate. Lieutenant Tanaka's radio operators were receiving contradictory reports. One outer position reported contact. 2 men down, unclear direction. A second reported no contact. A third reported movement in a sector assessed as outside any viable American approach. Sergeant Major Kenji Iwata, a 15-year veteran who had served at Wuhan and Nanjing, moved to the southwestern corner firing pit and looked down the slope. He tried to count the attackers. He could not. He saw movement. One moment here, then nothing, then movement from a completely different angle. He picked up his field telephone. His word to Tanaka was kazokaze, the family storm. Something arriving from a direction that makes no sense. How many? Tanaka asked. Iwata watched the slope for 30 more seconds. I don't know, he said. That was the first crack. Reese was moving between firing positions along the left flank, approaching, drawing fire, gone before it converged, appearing next from a slightly different angle. He'd covered 40 meters in 11 minutes. He had 12 rounds remaining. His left arm was burning the way a wound burns when it's been ignored for long enough that the body stops asking for attention and starts demanding it. He found the civilians at 0947. They were in a coral overhang 20 meters below the cave entrance he'd been working toward. A woman, perhaps 40 years old, 2 and 2 children pressed against her in the back of the alcove. Palawan. Locals who had been trapped there since the fighting began, too frightened to move in any direction. The younger child could not have been more than 5 or 6 years old, curled against the woman's side with both fists tight around the fabric of her sleeve. The woman looked at Reese with an expression that wasn't quite fear. It was the face of someone who has been deciding whether to run for so long that they've lost track of what running feels like. Reese stopped. He was 25 meters from the cave entrance. He had the angle. He had the approach. He had spent 40 minutes of bleeding and crawling and calculating to reach this exact position. Moving now without accounting for these 3 people meant a firefight that would sweep directly through their overhang. He changed his route. He went around them, not the efficient route, the route that kept them behind rock. It added 4 minutes to his approach. It exposed him for 11 additional seconds to the field of fire from the upper pit. And in those 11 seconds, a burst of fire caught the coral around his feet. Fragments across his right forearm, one drawing blood, a second cutting through the palm of his hand. He lost his footing, slid 2 meters down the slope, had to cover the lost ground again. Both arms now, both burning. He didn't look back at the woman and the children. He had put them behind him, which meant they were as safe as he could make them. He had 8 rounds in the garand, 1 clip in his pouch. At 1019 he reached the cave entrance. He pressed against the coral wall beside the cave entrance and did not move for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time when your arms are bleeding and your water is gone and your last meal was 11 hours ago in the dark before the assault. And the only sounds reaching you are the echo of fire from positions you can't see, and the distant crackle of a radio frequency that has stopped being relevant to your situation. He didn't try to calculate his next move. He couldn't. There was a thin wrongness over everything. Colors slightly too vivid, sounds carrying an extra layer beneath them. And he recognized it the way a man recognizes the early edges of something serious. Blood loss. Not critical yet. Critical enough. He looked at his hands, and they were pressed flat against the coral, and they were shaking at a low, constant frequency. And he watched them for a long moment the way you watch a problem you haven't solved yet but know you will have to. He reached into his breast pocket. The letter? Margaret's letter, September 3rd. Folded into quarters, the paper worn soft from weeks of humidity and the habit of being touched. He didn't unfold it. He held it in his palm. A flat, weightless thing that somehow weighed more than everything else combined. Just come home, Cal. Everything else is just everything else. He put it back. He should have retreated. He understood this with the part of his mind that was still cold and analytical. A single wounded rifleman was not the correct tool for an occupied, fortified hill. G Company had pulled back for a reason, and the radio silence had a tactical justification. A man who retreated now was not a coward. He was following the revised order that command had issued. He was doing the correct thing. But to retreat meant crossing the machine gun field again. And before crossing the field, he would pass the coral overhang. And in the coral overhang was a woman and 2 children who were still there because he had passed them once already and not been killed, which meant his presence in this sector. This one wounded rifleman who should not logically exist at this elevation was the only reason the fighting hadn't swept directly through where they were sitting. He thought about the 4 men he'd seen go down at 0733. He knew their names. He checked the garand, 8 rounds in the current clip. He had 1 clip in the pouch, the pistol. 16 rounds plus whatever the pistol held. He exhaled slowly. He looked at the cave entrance. He stood up. He did not go through the cave entrance. He went past it, 3 meters to the right, to a position on the slope where he could see what he had been looking at for 2 hours without being able to act on. The dead ground beneath the lip of the upper firing pit. A narrow column of terrain 15 meters wide where the defensive geometry collapsed. The position had been designed with overlapping arcs that covered every standard approach lane, but the arcs had one mathematical consequence. To cover a wide frontage, each position's gunners were oriented slightly outward. The space directly beneath the pit's forward lip, almost vertically below it, was in no gun's primary arc. It was visible from one place, his crater, after 26 minutes of watching at the right angle, in the right light. He moved. Inside the Japanese position, Lieutenant Tanaka's command structure was failing. Sergeant Major Iwata reported that 2 more outer positions had gone silent. Not from artillery, from something moving through angles that shouldn't have been accessible. Runners dispatched to the inner positions were not returning. He could hear his own men, soldiers who had held this hill against 3 Marine battalions, arguing in lowered voices about where the threat was coming from. "Close the tunnel exits," Tanaka ordered. "Pull the inner positions together." 2 of the 3 dispatched runners did not come back. In the upper firing pit, 3 men who had not been wounded in 6 weeks of fighting were no longer a coordinated unit, and they were 3 frightened individuals who could not agree on the direction of the danger. One scanned left, one scanned below. One had stopped scanning entirely and was calling into the tunnel opening behind them in a voice that carried none of the register of command. Cal Reese came over the lip from below, from the dead ground, from the angle that the entire defensive architecture had failed to account for. He was inside the pit before anyone in it had processed the geometry of where he'd come from. He moved, he fired, he moved. Down through the connecting trench, 30 meters of narrow coral passage that he navigated from the blueprint he'd built in his mind from 40 minutes of external observation. Imperfect. Fast enough. 20 meters. 10. In the lower position, the 2-man machine gun crew heard the footsteps coming through the trench. Heard the sound that was wrong, that didn't match the weight or rhythm of any boot they recognized. And they broke. They went for the tunnel entrance. One made it. The Type 92 machine gun that had killed 4 of his platoon brothers before 0800 that morning was still mounted, still loaded, still oriented down the slope toward the ground Cal Reese had crawled across bleeding for 90 minutes. He swung it around. He fired a sustained burst into the upper tunnel entrance, not aimed at men, aimed at the concept of anyone coming back through that opening. And then he dropped below the gun mount and pressed himself against the rear wall of the pit. Silence. He waited 30 seconds. Below him, visible through the forward embrasure, on the coral overhang was still. The woman and the 2 children were still there. Still exactly where he'd left them. They were clear. The last shot in the Hill 140 position was fired at 11:18. After it, there was a silence that had physical weight, the kind of silence that exists only after sound has been at full volume for long enough that its absence registers as a presence. Cal Reese leaned against the coral wall of the lower firing pit, both arms bleeding, ammunition exhausted. He reached into his breast pocket. He held Margaret's letter against his chest and breathed. The first Americans reached Hill 140 at 12:04. Staff Sergeant Eldon Watts, who had spent 2 hours coordinating fire support before forcing a path through the machine gun fields, came over the lip of the upper pit and stopped. He stood there for a moment. He counted. He counted again. Then he sent a runner back to battalion with a number that battalion relayed to regimental headquarters with the word "unconfirmed" attached, because no officer at regiment was prepared to accept it without verification. Regimental confirmed it the following day. 1 man, wounded with a single M1 Garand, had reduced a fortified defensive position that 3 Marine battalions had died trying to crack over the preceding 6 weeks. The enemy dead recovered in and around the Hill 140 network exceeded what the original intelligence assessment had said the entire garrison contained. 3 weeks after the battle, interrogators working with Japanese prisoners captured in the final reduction of the Umurbrogol pocket asked a standard question that began appearing across multiple separate interrogation transcripts. And the question was, how many Americans attacked Hill 140 on October 14th? The answers varied. 3, 5, perhaps 10. One prisoner, a corporal from Lieutenant Tanaka's unit who had been in the tunnel system during the final assault, was the only man who answered correctly. 1, he said. Through the interpreter, his next words were recorded verbatim. 1 American who moved as though he did not understand that his position was impossible, or understood it better than we did. The interrogator's reaction was not recorded. Among the survivors of the Hill 140 garrison, in testimonies gathered after the war, the American who had come through that morning acquired a name. They called him Kagero no Shoteki. In Japanese, Kagero is the mayfly, not as a symbol of fragility but of total purpose within a single day. And the mayfly does everything it must do before dark. It appears where water meets air, the most dangerous boundary, and does not behave as though it knows this. The name was born from one specific thing they could not explain, a man who moved through positions their training said were inaccessible, who was still advancing when every defensive logic said he should have been dead, and who, once the position fell, was simply gone, replaced by the silence of a hill that had fired continuously for 6 weeks and had stopped. A surviving NCO from Sergeant Major Iwata's unit, interviewed by a Japanese journalist after repatriation in the war's end, described October 14th in 3 sentences. The translation reads, "We were a prepared position that had stopped a full Marine division. Of one American came alone and did not leave until we were finished. I have thought about this many times and I still do not have the word in any language for what he was." The woman in the coral overhang was named Mireille. She was 39 years old, a native Palauan whose village had been destroyed in the early bombardment. When she was interviewed by a Red Cross interpreter 2 weeks after the battle, she described a wounded American soldier who had stopped his assault to change his route so that her children would not be caught in the crossfire. A man who was bleeding from both arms and had not asked for water and had not said anything to her at all, who had just looked at her and the children, changed his direction and gone on. "He put us first," she said. "A man in that much danger still put us first." She did not learn his name until after the war ended. Private First Class Calvin Reese, G Company, 2nd Battalion, 321st Infantry Regiment, 81st Infantry Division, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on October 14, 1944, at the Umurbrogol pocket, Peleliu, Palau Islands. The official citation read, in part, "Private First Class Reese, with complete disregard for his personal safety, and despite wounds sustained during the initial assault, advanced alone against a heavily fortified enemy position after his unit was separated by intense enemy fire, through extraordinary skill, tactical judgment, and determination. Private First Class Reese systematically neutralized the enemy stronghold, silencing multiple automatic weapons positions. His actions, he performed alone and without support, were directly responsible for securing a position that had resisted previous assault operations and prevented further casualties among advancing friendly forces." Military citation language is precise and spare by design. What the citation does not tell you: that when Watts reached him in the lower firing pit, Cal Reese's first words were not about the position or the mission or himself. He asked about the civilians in the coral overhang. Were they clear? Were they all right? Watts confirmed they were. Reese nodded. Then he let the medic work on his arms. The capture of Hill 140 opened a critical angle on the Umurbrogol pocket, enabling the 321st Infantry Regiment's flanking maneuver that accelerated the final reduction of the Japanese garrison. The battle for Peleliu ended November 27, 1944. Colonel Nakagawa, in the position's final hours, transmitted his last radio report, destroyed his regimental battle colors, and followed the code of an officer who understood what the end of a position meant. The 14th Division, the Utsunomiya Division, with its campaign streamers from the Russo-Japanese War and a decade of China, had been stopped in the Umurbrogol pocket. The crack in the defensive architecture that began the end ran through Hill 140. Through a single wounded man with a Garand and a dead ground angle nobody else had found. Cal Reese recovered from his wounds at a military hospital in Guam. He returned to Muncie, Indiana in early 1945. He went back to the farm. He planted corn that spring. He didn't speak publicly about Peleliu for many years, carrying what he'd done quietly without display, as something that belonged to him and was not for general consumption. He came home. That's the part that's easy to say and the hardest to fully understand. He came home with wounds that healed and a decoration that went into a box on a shelf and a story that he told almost nobody. Not because it hadn't happened, not because he was uncertain of it, but because he didn't know how to explain what it had cost to become the man who did it and remain the man who came back. The Japanese called him Kagero no Shoteki, the Mayfly warrior. Men who had trained for years, who had built a position designed to stop a regiment, who had held it against everything the Marine Corps could bring. Those men gave him a name, not because protocol required it, not because they were being generous, because what had happened to their position on October 14th, 1944 required a word, and the words they already had were not sufficient. He had been given wrong intelligence and sent into a position nearly twice as strong as anyone knew. His orders changed at the worst possible moment, leaving him isolated on the wrong side of a machine gun field. He was ambushed by a hidden position at maximum exposure and survived by 3.2 seconds of trained reflex. He chose a longer, more dangerous route so that a woman and 2 children would stay behind cover. And that choice cost him blood from both arms. He finished the mission with 16 rounds and a letter in his pocket. And the first thing he said when it was over was, "Are the civilians all right? And if you are a veteran, if you have stood in a moment where everything collapsed and you had to find what was underneath the training and the doctrine and the plan that had just failed, you know this weight. You've carried it. Some of you are still carrying it. If you've never worn a uniform, he was not extraordinary from birth. He was 22 years old from a grain farm outside Muncie, Indiana. He could shoot because he'd learned on the back 40 since he was 12. He was patient because the flatlands teach patience. He was brave because a 17-year-old girl had written him a letter. "Just come home, Cal. Everything else is just everything else." And he had promised her. He kept it. He went home. He planted his corn. And whatever he carried from Hill 140, he carried it without asking anyone to share the weight. And somewhere in the interrogation transcripts, in the NCO's 3 sentences, in Mireille's description of a bleeding soldier who changed his route for her children, is the truest accounting of what Calvin Reese was on that October morning. Not what his own army said he was, what the men who tried hardest to stop him said, when they had no reason to say anything at all. The Mayfly warrior came in one day, finished what needed finishing, then he went home. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories of extraordinary American courage. And who should we tell next? Drop their name in the comments.